Hello, everyone. My name is Grania Martinez. I'm 29 years old, and for a long time, I thought I understood what pain looked like. I thought pain was quiet, the kind you swallow at family dinners when the jokes always land on you and everyone laughs like it's harmless. I thought pain was working two jobs while pretending your body doesn't ache, because complaining only makes things worse. I thought pain was watching your mother grow smaller every year and telling yourself it was just stress. Just age. Just life. I was wrong. Pain has witnesses. It echoes in hospital rooms. It freezes nurses mid-step. It leaves you on the floor, bleeding, while someone stands over you insisting you deserve it. 3 days after surgery, while I was still stitched together and barely able to stand, my stepfather decided I was lying. He decided I was inconvenient, and in one moment of rage, he showed me exactly how disposable I was to him. What I didn't know then, what he never imagined, was that this single act would crack open everything he'd spent years building. Before this story ends, federal agents will walk him out in handcuffs. His name will become a warning. And my mother, who everyone thought was just getting sick, will survive something far worse than any of us understood. But none of that was clear yet. Back then, I was still on the floor of a hospital room, tasting blood, trying to understand how my life had turned into something that felt like a crime scene. If you're still with me, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps these stories reach the people who might need them most. The cold tile pressed against my cheek as I tried to breathe through the pain. My surgical incisions screamed every time I moved, a reminder that I wasn't supposed to be standing, let alone falling. I heard shoes before I saw anyone, the squeak of nurses rushing toward me, voices sharp and urgent. I'd been out of emergency surgery for exactly 3 days when Caleb Whitmore, my stepfather of 3 years, decided I was faking weakness. My appendix had ruptured. The surgeon told me afterward that I'd been about 2 hours away from something catastrophic. "You're lucky," he said, adjusting his glasses. Caleb started complaining about the hospital bills before I even woke up from anesthesia. That morning, his voice filled the room before his body did, sharp, impatient, like he owned the air itself. My mother sat in the corner, silent. She'd perfected that silence over the last 3 years, shrinking inward whenever his tone shifted. He paced at the foot of my bed, ranting about money. About how his hard-earned income wasn't meant to support freeloaders, about how I needed to start pulling my weight. It didn't matter that I'd been working 2 jobs before my body gave out. It didn't matter that I paid rent to live in the house I grew up in. When I told him the doctor had ordered at least 2 weeks of recovery, something in his face changed. Not concern, not surprise, offense. The slap came so fast I didn't register the movement, only the impact. One moment I was propped against hospital pillows, the next I was on the floor. My IV stand crashed beside me. Alarms screamed in protest. The championship ring from his bowling league split my lip. Caleb stood over me, breathing hard, yelling about pretending, about drama, about money. The irony almost hurt more than the blow. He'd created the most dramatic scene of all. Then the room filled with people. 2 nurses, a security guard, and finally police. The rage drained from Caleb's face the moment the officer stepped inside. He straightened his shirt, smoothed his hair, and launched into explanations. Misunderstanding, tough love, kids these days. He called me a kid, even though I was nearly 30. One of the officers, Rachel Collins, looked from him to me, blood on my gown, nurses checking my incision, and something settled behind her eyes. She'd seen this before. My mother finally spoke. Not to defend me, to defend him. She talked about stress, about bills, about how hard things had been. Her words tried to soften the moment, but her eyes told a different story. Fear lived there, exhaustion, the kind that comes from years of walking on eggshells. From the other bed, my hospital roommate, an 83-year-old woman named Margaret recovering from hip surgery, kept pressing her call button. She demanded to give a statement. She said she had no patience for men who thought their fists made them important. The police made Caleb leave the hospital. They couldn't make him leave our lives. Not yet. By the time I was discharged, he was already back home, acting like nothing had happened. My mother picked me up alone. She offered excuses neither of us believed as we drove through afternoon traffic. I stared out the window and realized something unsettling. That slap hadn't come out of nowhere. It had come from somewhere practiced, familiar. And as the painkillers wore off and bruises began to bloom, I understood that what happened in that hospital room wasn't the beginning of my story. It was the moment the truth finally slipped. To understand how my life ended up on a hospital floor, you have to go back to a different hospital room. One that smelled nothing like antiseptic, and everything like goodbye. My father died slowly. Cancer does that. It stretches grief into something you learn to live inside. For almost 2 years, our lives revolved around appointments, waiting rooms, medication schedules, and the careful optimism doctors are trained to deliver. Even with insurance, the bills stacked up like accusations. Every envelope that arrived in the mail carried the same message: you are not prepared for this. I was in my mid-20s then, juggling retail shifts and freelance work, telling myself exhaustion was temporary. My mother tried to stay strong, but strength looks different when you're watching the person you love disappear by inches. By the time my father passed, we weren't just grieving, we were drowning. The house felt wrong without him. Too quiet, too big, and suddenly far too expensive. Life insurance covered the mortgage, barely. Medical debt lingered like a second shadow. I told myself we'd recover, that we just needed time, that things would stabilize. Time, it turned out, wasn't what my mother was afraid of. She was afraid of losing everything. That's when Caleb Whitmore appeared. He came into our lives the way people like him often do, not loudly, not aggressively, but wrapped in reassurance. He and my mother met through a mutual friend at a book club, of all places. He listened more than he talked at first. He asked questions, remembered details, made my mother feel seen at a moment when most of the world had stopped looking. Compared to grief, his attention felt like relief. Caleb had stories about business, about strategy, about how people shouldn't have to struggle alone. He drove a sleek Corvette, wore clothes that looked expensive without being flashy, and spoke with the certainty of a man who expected to be believed. At first, I wanted to believe him too. He said the right things about my father, about stepping up, about stability after loss. He framed himself as someone who understood responsibility, not just emotionally, but financially. 6 months after they met, they were married. When I raised concerns, gently, carefully, my mother smiled in that tired way people do when they're done questioning good news. "Grania," she said, "we deserve a break." So I swallowed my doubts. Caleb moved into our home immediately after the wedding, and with him came changes that didn't announce themselves as rules. They arrived disguised as solutions. He offered to help manage finances, said my mother shouldn't have to worry about numbers while she was grieving, suggested combining accounts temporarily to simplify things, talked about tax efficiency, asset protection, long-term planning. It all sounded responsible, adult. What it really was, I wouldn't understand until much later. At first, the shifts were subtle. My mother stopped opening the mail. Caleb said it stressed her out. He insisted on handling bills, explaining numbers in ways that made questions feel childish. When paperwork went missing, he shrugged it off. When I asked where certain statements were, he smiled and told me not to worry. He had a way of patting my head, figuratively, and sometimes literally, like I was a confused kid rather than a grown woman paying rent in her own childhood home. After a car accident years earlier, I'd qualified for disability assistance. It wasn't much, but it helped. Caleb suggested it made sense for that money to go into the household account for budgeting purposes. He said he'd make sure it was allocated properly. Somehow, we were always short. We tightened our belts, cut expenses, skipped things we used to enjoy. Meanwhile, Caleb's Corvette never missed an oil change. His bowling nights never stopped. His comforts remained untouched. My mother changed too. Not dramatically, not all at once. She grew quieter, more hesitant. She started getting sick, first stomach issues, then fatigue, then days where she couldn't quite focus. Doctors chalked it up to stress, grief, hormones. Caleb took charge of her care the same way he'd taken charge of everything else. He ordered supplements online, insisted on special vitamins, told her store-bought options weren't good enough, watched closely as she swallowed them each morning, like it mattered more than it should have. I noticed things then. Or maybe I noticed them and chose not to understand. Family visits grew tense and rare. Caleb had a sharp tongue and a long memory. People learned quickly it was easier to stay away than to push back. Even I began measuring my words, gauging his mood before speaking. Life adjusted around him. That's the part that's hardest to explain to people who've never lived it. You don't wake up one day and realize you're trapped. You adapt, you rationalize, you survive. By the time my appendix ruptured, exhaustion was my default state. I worked through pain because pain was familiar. I ignored warning signs because inconvenience had consequences. When Caleb stood in that hospital room, angry about bills before I was even fully conscious, it didn't come out of nowhere. It fit. Only then, flat on the floor with nurses shouting and alarms screaming, did I feel something shift. Not clarity, not yet. Just a question I couldn't quiet. How did we get here? That question followed me home from the hospital. It followed me from room to room as my body healed faster than my understanding. The bruises would fade, the stitches would dissolve, but the doubt stayed. And for the first time, instead of pushing it down, I let it sit. Because something in me finally understood this much. Caleb hadn't arrived to save us. He'd arrived when we were weakest, and men like that don't show up to rescue, they show up to take. The house didn't change overnight. That's what made it dangerous. Nothing dramatic happened after we got home from the hospital. No shouting, no threats, no visible bruises beyond the ones already fading on my skin. Life resumed in a way that almost felt normal, if you didn't look too closely. But something had shifted. The house felt tighter. Not physically, but emotionally. Like the walls had moved a few inches closer while no one was paying attention. Conversations grew shorter. Not because there was nothing to say, but because everything suddenly felt like it required permission. I noticed how my mother paused before speaking, how she glanced down the hallway, as if listening for footsteps even when Caleb wasn't home. When he was, she measured every sentence. Caleb didn't interrupt her. He didn't need to. He'd wait until she finished, then offer a calm correction. A gentle laugh. A reminder. "You've been tired lately," he'd say. "You know how that affects your focus." He said it kindly. Often. Until she started saying it herself. That was when I understood he wasn't just managing our lives. He was shaping reality. If my mother forgot something, it wasn't human error. It was proof. If I questioned a decision, it wasn't curiosity. It was immaturity. Every challenge became evidence that we were incapable, and that his presence wasn't just helpful but necessary. Family stopped visiting. Not because anyone was banned, but because time with Caleb was exhausting. He asked too many questions, remembered too much, made jokes that landed just shy of polite. People learned it was easier to stay away than to push back. Even neighbors grew distant. Conversations ended when Caleb stepped outside. Doors closed more quickly. No one accused him of anything. They didn't have to. Discomfort has its own language. Inside the house, silence replaced conflict. Caleb preferred it that way. If my mother disagreed with him, even gently, he'd withdraw. Days without eye contact. No conversation, no warmth, the kind of absence that punishes without leaving marks. Eventually, she learned that peace depended on agreement. So did I. I began censoring myself without realizing it. I stopped asking where paperwork was, stopped pointing out inconsistencies. It felt safer to let things pass than to risk that cold, watchful stillness. That's how psychological cages are built, not with bars, but with consequences. My mother's health continued to decline. At first, it was easy to explain away. Fatigue, stomach pain, headaches. Doctors shrugged it off as stress layered on grief. But over time, something else crept in. Uncertainty. Some days she'd ask the same question twice, then apologize for it. Other days, she'd trail off mid-sentence, frustration flashing across her face, as if the thought had slipped through a crack she couldn't see. Caleb noticed everything. He documented her symptoms in a notebook, spoke for her at appointments, answered questions before she could. When doctors asked how she was feeling, he explained it for her, efficiently, confidently, while she sat beside him, nodding along. I tried to step in once, just once, to clarify something she'd told me earlier that day. Caleb smiled without warmth. She gets confused, he said lightly. It's been happening more often. He said it to the doctor, to me, to the room. And just like that, my mother's voice became optional. At home, I started noticing things I couldn't unsee. Caleb always positioned himself between us during conversations, always sat closest to my mother, always placed a hand on her shoulder when she spoke, like a reminder of who was steady and who wasn't. He framed decisions as protection. You don't need to worry about that. I'll take care of it. That's too much for you right now. The words sounded considerate. The effect was suffocating. I started sleeping lightly, waking at small noises. I found myself tracking Caleb's movements through the house without realizing I was doing it. The space that once felt familiar now felt monitored. Still, I had nothing concrete. That was the worst part. There were no dramatic confrontations, no proof I could point to without sounding paranoid, just an accumulation of moments that left me uneasy in ways I couldn't articulate. And that fear, of being dismissed, of being labeled dramatic, kept me quiet. Caleb thrived in that quiet. The turning point wasn't an argument. It was a look. One evening, my mother struggled to finish a sentence. She frowned, searching for the right word. I waited, ready to help. Before I could, I saw something pass over Caleb's face, not concern, not impatience, assessment, like he was watching a process unfold exactly as expected. That look followed me into the hospital weeks later, when my body finally forced me to stop ignoring pain. Lying in that bed after surgery, away from the constant pressure of the house, I felt something unfamiliar. Space. No one correcting my thoughts, no one shaping my questions before I finished asking them. Just the steady rhythm of machines and the silence to let memories line up instead of blur together. The quiet was terrifying. Because in that quiet, I began to see that what we'd been living in wasn't chaos or bad luck. It had shape, it had rhythm. It depended on us staying tired, staying unsure, staying small. I didn't yet know how deep it went, but I knew this much. Whatever Caleb was doing, it relied on us not paying attention. And as I lay there, stitches pulling with every breath, one thought settled with a clarity that refused to leave. If I didn't start paying attention now, I might not get another chance. The first thing I noticed during recovery wasn't the pain, it was the quiet. Hospital quiet is different from house quiet. It doesn't feel judgmental. It doesn't listen back. The machines beep whether you're brave or afraid. And for the first time in years, no one corrected my thoughts mid-sentence. Recovery forced stillness on me. I couldn't clean. I couldn't work. I couldn't fill the hours with motion to keep questions from settling. So I lay there, stitched together, and thought. At first, my mind circled the slap, the impact, the floor, the way Caleb's face changed when the police walked in. I replayed it until the details dulled, hoping understanding might undo it. It didn't. Memories don't organize themselves when you chase them. They organize when you stop running. As the days passed, other moments surfaced. Not loudly, quietly, lining up in ways they never had before. I noticed timing. Every time I'd saved enough money to think about moving out, something unexpected drained it away. A bill I'd never seen, an emergency I couldn't verify. A situation framed as urgent enough to stop questions. Every time my mother started asking about finances, wondering where money was going, she got sick. Not dramatically, not immediately, but predictably. Headaches, stomach pain, exhaustion that pinned her to bed. During those stretches, Caleb stepped in fully, handled everything, made decisions while she was too weak to object. From a distance, it could look like coincidence. From a hospital bed, it didn't. I started writing things down on the back of my discharge paperwork: dates, symptoms, conversations. I wasn't trying to prove anything yet. I just needed to see whether the unease in my chest had shape. It did. The nursing staff rotated often, but one nurse, Emily, asked different questions. Not intrusive ones, the kind that offered space without demanding answers. How are things at home? Do you feel safe resting there? On my discharge day, while Caleb argued with billing at the desk, Emily slipped a folded card into my paperwork. She didn't explain, just squeezed my hand once and met my eyes. Later, alone in the bathroom, I unfolded it: a domestic violence hotline, a website, resources I'd never imagined needing. I stared at the card longer than I want to admit. Domestic violence didn't fit the story I'd been telling myself. It sounded too extreme, too obvious. But that night, with the lights off and my phone dimmed, I visited the site. It didn't talk much about hitting. It talked about control, isolation, financial dependence, medical manipulation. I felt my chest tighten. It was like reading my life, written by someone brave enough to name it. When I went home, Caleb wasn't allowed back into the hospital. He waited there instead. My mother picked me up alone, offering excuses neither of us believed. As we drove, she kept one hand clenched tightly on the steering wheel, like letting go might cause everything to collapse. At home, I was told to rest, to stay in bed, to let Caleb handle things. He spoke softly now, carefully. The police visit had changed his approach. He watched me more closely, measured his words. I watched him back. Recovery gave me an excuse to slow down without raising suspicion. I listened. I observed. I noticed what didn't quite make sense. I noticed how Caleb always prepared my mother's food himself, how he insisted on controlling her supplements, how he discouraged her from leaving the house, citing her health. I noticed how my presence irritated him when I was alert, how conversations shifted when I entered a room, how information arrived filtered, partial, delayed, incomplete. Still, I had no proof. Knowing something is wrong without being able to prove it is its own kind of torment. It makes you doubt your instincts, makes you wonder if you're the problem. That doubt was exactly where Caleb wanted me. One afternoon, while my mother slept, I stood in the hallway and looked at the locked door at the end. Caleb's home office. I'd never been inside. He claimed it held important business documents. He kept it locked at all times. The lock felt deliberate, symbolic. Secrets don't survive in open rooms. I didn't touch it then. I wasn't ready. Acting too soon could make things worse. I knew that instinctively. Instead, I kept watching. The more I observed, the clearer it became. Nothing in our house existed without passing through Caleb first. Money, information, decisions, even concern. Once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. At night, when the house was quiet, I went back to the hotline website, not looking for instructions, just recognition. The fear I felt wasn't unique. The confusion wasn't weakness, it was response. By the time my stitches were due to come out, I understood something else too. Whatever was happening in our house wasn't accidental, and accidents don't require locks. I didn't yet know what I'd find behind that door. I didn't know how deep it went or how dangerous it might be. I only knew the next step wouldn't come from thinking harder or doubting less. It would come from opening something that had been closed on purpose. And the most important one was waiting for me at the end of the hall. The lock on Caleb's office door stopped being background noise once I understood what it represented. It sat at the end of the hallway like a held breath, quiet, deliberate, always closed. I passed it dozens of times a day during my recovery, careful not to look at it for too long, careful not to let curiosity show on my face. Caleb called it his workspace. Important documents, private matters. He said it casually, the way he said everything that wasn't meant to be questioned. The opportunity came 2 weeks later. Caleb left town for a 3-day bowling tournament. He'd been talking about it for months, oil patterns, lane conditions, how this was his year. He took money from my mother's emergency fund to cover the trip, promising he'd win it back. My mother was having one of her bad days, pale, exhausted, barely awake. The house fell quiet the moment his car disappeared down the street. Too quiet. I stood in the hallway longer than I needed to, staring at the office door. Part of me still hoped I'd open it and find nothing. Just boring paperwork. Proof that I'd been wrong. That hope was the last thing denial had to offer. I didn't have a key. What I did have was time, a phone, and the kind of focus that comes when you know hesitation might cost you more than action. It turned out the expensive-looking lock Caleb had installed was far less impressive beneath the surface. The click was soft when it finally gave way. The room smelled faintly of dust and cologne. It was neat. Too neat. File boxes labeled in precise handwriting, shelves arranged with obsessive care, a desk positioned to face the door, as if he expected to be watched even when alone. I closed the door behind me, locked it. My hands shook as I opened the first file. Marriage certificates, plural. I counted them slowly. 4 marriages before my mother. Not 2, like he'd claimed. Each one lasted just a few years. Each ended with restraining orders. Different states, same outcome. Court documents, police reports, notes about relocation and fresh starts. This wasn't history. It was pattern. Then I found paperwork with my name on it. Credit cards I'd never applied for. Loans I'd never taken out. Disability benefits filed under my Social Security number. Benefits I'd been told were delayed or reduced. The amounts were small enough to avoid alarms, large enough to add up. My credit score wasn't just damaged, it was destroyed. I had to sit down. Breathing felt optional as the weight of it settled. This wasn't mismanagement, it wasn't confusion. It was identity theft, committed by someone who ate dinner across from me. Then I saw the life insurance policies. 3 of them, all taken out within the last year. All on my mother. All naming Caleb as the sole beneficiary. The total payout sat there in clean black ink, $1.8 million. For a woman who'd been healthy before Caleb entered her life, she'd been sick far too often lately. I thought about the supplements, the insistence, the way he watched her swallow them. My stomach turned. I photographed everything, every page, every label, every signature. I forced myself to move slowly, methodically. Panic would only make mistakes easier. If you're still with me at this point, take a second to like this video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. What happens next only works because someone paid attention. The laptop sat on the desk. Open. Logged in. For a man obsessed with control, Caleb was careless when he believed himself untouchable. His inbox told a story he'd never intended anyone to read. Active dating profiles. Recent messages. He described himself as a widower, successful, no children, looking for a traditional woman. My mother was asleep in the next room. There were emails with a lawyer about selling our house, my father's house. Questions about power of attorney, about mental incompetence, about what would happen if my mother could no longer make decisions for herself. I scrolled through his browser history, searches about undetectable poisons, inducing heart attacks, making deaths look natural. I gripped the edge of the desk until my knuckles ached. This wasn't imagination, it wasn't paranoia, it was intent. I took photos until my phone battery dipped into the red. Then I put everything back exactly where I'd found it, files aligned, laptop closed, lock resecured. When I stepped into the hallway, the house felt different. like it knew what I'd learned. That night, after my mother fell asleep, I sat on my bed staring at the names from those marriage certificates. I didn't know what I was doing yet. I only knew I couldn't do it alone. People leave digital footprints, even careful ones. I started with one name, Megan Foster. I sent a message with only Caleb's name and a photo. She replied within an hour. He got another. Our first call lasted 3 hours. Her story mirrored mine in ways that made my skin crawl. The whirlwind romance, the financial control, the mysterious illnesses. She'd escaped when she caught him putting something in her coffee. She hadn't stayed quiet. By morning, I wasn't just holding documents. I was holding confirmation. And I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to think before. What I'd found in that office wasn't just evidence of betrayal. It was proof that coincidence had left the house a long time ago. By the time morning came, I hadn't slept. My phone lay beside me, screen dark but heavy, like it carried weight beyond its size. Megan's words, "He got another," echoed louder than anything I'd found in Caleb's office. Confirmation changes things. It doesn't bring relief. It sharpens fear into focus. Megan's voice shook when she told her story, but not from uncertainty, from memory. The kind that doesn't fade just because time passes. She talked about the whirlwind romance, the way Caleb stepped in right when her life felt unstable, the financial help that slowly turned into control, and the illnesses, headaches, confusion, fatigue, supplements she hadn't questioned at first, coffee that tasted strange. The moment she caught him adding something she couldn't identify, and the instant understanding that followed. She'd left that night, no plan, no proof, just instinct and terror. "After you leave," she told me quietly, "you start seeing how careful he really is." She wasn't wrong. By the end of the week, Megan connected me to Helen Cooper and Donna Reed. Different states, different years, same story, retold with small variations. Each of them had been strong in their own way, independent, capable. None of them thought they were the type of women this could happen to. That belief didn't protect them. We started comparing timelines. Not formally, not yet, just sharing documents, screenshots, court records, emails. What felt overwhelming to me looked disturbingly organized when laid side by side. The pattern was unmistakable. Caleb didn't rush. He positioned himself. He waited for dependence. Then he tightened control. Illness followed predictably. So did paperwork, power of attorney, financial access, isolation. One name ended every conversation. Rachel Moore. Official records listed a heart attack. No autopsy. No investigation. Caleb had moved out of state within months. There were questions none of them had ever been able to answer. We didn't say what we were all thinking. We didn't have to. The group chat became our lifeline. Different time zones, different lives. One shared reality. Messages came at all hours. Fragments of memory, scanned documents, phrases Caleb reused word for word. It was like reading the same script with different casts. 15 years. That was how long he'd been doing this. For the first time, I let myself use the word I'd been avoiding. Systematic. This wasn't a series of bad decisions. It wasn't mismanagement. It wasn't coincidence. It was a method. Knowing that didn't make things easier. It made them terrifying, because if the pattern held, and everything suggested it did, then my mother was exactly where his others had been before things went wrong. And I was living in the house with him, pretending not to know. Caleb returned from the tournament loud and energized, talking about near wins and bad luck. He barely looked at me as he spoke, barely acknowledged my presence beyond a distracted nod. That suited me. I leaned into the version of myself he expected, still recovering, still fragile, still out of the way. I moved slowly. Let myself look smaller than I felt. It was the most convincing performance of my life. At night, the group chat never slept. Helen shared court documents from her divorce, claims Caleb had made about her mental instability. Donna described the accident that left her hospitalized for weeks, the one that conveniently gave Caleb temporary control over her medical decisions. Power of attorney. The phrase surfaced again a few days later at our kitchen table. Caleb slid a stack of papers toward my mother like it was nothing more than a receipt. His tone was casual, almost bored. "Just something the lawyer recommended," he said, "given how sick you've been." My mother stared at the papers, unfocused. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for the pen. She looked at me, not fully aware of why, just knowing she needed reassurance. Caleb wanted me to witness her signature. I felt panic flare and forced it down. If I reacted, he'd know. Instead, I tilted my head, kept my voice soft. "Shouldn't the lawyer be here?" I asked. "Just to make sure it's all done properly?" His smile faltered. Just enough. He couldn't refuse without raising questions, so he agreed to schedule a formal signing for the following week, 7 days. The cruise was booked for 10 days out. The timing wasn't subtle anymore. In the group chat, the response was immediate, short, focused. He had tried this before. Donna told us about a romantic getaway that ended in injury and confusion. Helen remembered pressure around property transfer. Piece by piece, the playbook filled in. This wasn't escalation. It was culmination. That night, I sat alone in my room and faced the truth I could no longer avoid. Pretending to be weak wasn't just camouflage, it was strategy. As long as Caleb believed I was fragile, he underestimated me. As long as he underestimated me, I had time. But time was narrowing. Every day my mother grew quieter, the risk sharpened. Every day Caleb grew more confident, the window closed a little more. I didn't yet know exactly how we would stop him, but I knew this much. We wouldn't confront him. We would document him. And when the moment came, it wouldn't be chaos that ended him. It would be evidence. The first time Caleb mentioned the cruise, he said it like an afterthought. "Just a change of scenery," he told my mother, adjusting the blanket around her shoulders. "Somewhere warm, quiet, good for your health." My stomach tightened. He framed it as care, the way he framed everything, a gift, a reward. 2 weeks in the Caribbean, departing from Miami, just the two of them. No distractions, no stress, no witnesses. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. The group chat exploded the moment I typed the word cruise. Megan replied first, then Helen, then Donna. Short messages, no emojis, no questions, just confirmation. He had tried this before. In Donna's case, it had been a romantic getaway to celebrate their anniversary. She'd come back from that trip disoriented, injured after a fall she couldn't quite remember. It was during her recovery that Caleb had taken over her medical decisions, waiving paperwork she'd signed while medicated and confused. Power of attorney. That phrase surfaced a few days later at our kitchen table. Caleb slid a neat stack of documents across the wood, his tone casual, almost bored. "Just something the lawyer recommended," he said, "given how sick your mom's been." My mother stared at the papers without really seeing them. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the pen. She looked at me, eyes searching, unfocused, like she knew something was wrong but couldn't quite name it. He wanted me to witness her signature. The irony was almost unbearable. Power of attorney would give Caleb full control over my mother's medical and financial decisions, everything. And he was pushing for it now, when she was at her weakest, when confusion came easily and resistance took too much energy. I felt the familiar surge of panic rise in my chest and forced it down. If I reacted, he'd know. Instead, I tilted my head and spoke carefully, keeping my voice soft, uncertain. "Shouldn't the lawyer be here for something this important?" I asked. "Just to make sure it's all done properly?" Caleb's smile twitched, just for a second. He couldn't refuse without looking suspicious. He couldn't push without revealing his urgency. So he agreed to schedule a formal signing for the following week. 7 days. That was all we had. The cruise was booked for 10 days out. The timing wasn't subtle anymore. It was precise. The group chat went silent for a moment as the implications settled. Then it lit up with purpose. This wasn't just escalation. It was culmination. Megan dug through old files and found copies of the same POA language used in Donna's case. Helen remembered similar pressure around property transfer. Piece by piece, Caleb's playbook came into focus. Not a series of bad decisions, but a method. And methods can be documented. I started recording everything. Every conversation. Every meal where Caleb insisted on preparing my mother's food himself. Every moment he handed her supplements and watched her swallow them. I bought tiny cameras online, the kind disguised as phone chargers and digital clocks, and placed them carefully around the house. The kitchen, the living room, his office, even the bedroom, hidden where no one would think to look. I hated doing it. The invasion, the fear of being caught. But fear was already in the walls. I was just naming it. What the cameras captured made my blood run cold. Caleb practiced conversations when he thought he was alone. He stood in front of the mirror, rehearsing explanations, practicing concern, practicing grief. He timed his pauses, his sighs, his expressions like an actor refining a role. He counted money that didn't exist yet, made plans for after, discussed insurance payouts out loud, calculating futures that didn't include us. One night, I watched footage of him trying on a black suit, standing stiffly in front of the mirror while reciting what sounded like a eulogy. My mother was asleep in the next room. I had to pause the video to breathe. The supplements became the final piece. Our neighbor, Dorothy Miller, had noticed my mother's decline too. Her daughter Lauren was a pharmacist. When I showed her photos of the bottles Caleb ordered, labels, ingredients, dosages, her face drained of color. She was careful, professional. She didn't accuse, but she explained enough. Certain supplements, taken in high doses or combined improperly, could cause confusion, fatigue, organ stress, long-term damage that looked natural, accidental. It matched my mother's symptoms exactly. By the time Caleb increased the dosage, claiming flu season was coming, we knew we were out of time. The cruise loomed like a deadline. Caleb grew bolder as the departure date approached. He talked openly about how refreshing it would be for him to finally relax. He even suggested I stay with a distant aunt while they were gone, insisting I needed family support. When I called that aunt, she had no idea what I was talking about. He'd made it up. That was the moment I stopped feeling afraid and started feeling focused. This wasn't something we could manage privately. The risk was too high, the pattern too clear, the evidence too damning. We coordinated carefully. Federal authorities for the interstate fraud and identity theft, Adult Protective Services for my mother, local police for the assault, even the IRS, because stolen money leaves trails. The timing had to be perfect. Thursday night was championship playoffs at the bowling alley. Caleb wouldn't miss it. He left the house at 6:30, kissing my mother's forehead in a gesture that would have seemed tender if I hadn't seen what he put in her tea an hour earlier. At 7 o'clock, our front yard filled with vehicles. Agents, officers, social workers, paramedics. The house transformed into something unrecognizable. Voices, movement, purpose. My mother was confused but cooperative as they helped her into an ambulance, her supplements seized for testing. Computers and documents were boxed up. Every camera, every file, every recording accounted for. As they worked, I stood in the doorway and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Relief. Caleb was arrested at the bowling alley mid-game. They let him finish the frame. I appreciated that small cruelty. But that part of the story comes next. What matters is this. By the time he realized the trap had closed, every piece was already in place. The cruise, the paperwork, the recordings, the witnesses, the pattern. He had spent years perfecting control. And in the end, that control left fingerprints everywhere. By the time the house fell quiet again, Caleb was already somewhere else, confused, angry, insisting this was all a misunderstanding. I wasn't there to see the moment the agents approached him at the bowling alley. I heard about it later, in pieces. How they waited until he finished his frame, how the clatter of pins faded into a silence heavy enough to feel, how the handcuffs clicked closed while the people he'd borrowed money from watched, stunned. What I remember most clearly is the sound of the ambulance doors closing on my mother. She was dazed, frightened, asking why everyone was in the house. The paramedic spoke gently, explaining that she was going to the hospital, just to be safe. When they lifted her stretcher, she reached for my hand with surprising strength. "Don't leave," she whispered. "I'm not," I said. And for the first time, I meant it without fear. The days that followed were a blur of statements, interviews, and waiting rooms that felt far too familiar. Tests confirmed what we'd suspected. The supplements Caleb had been giving my mother, high doses, dangerous combinations, had been slowly damaging her health. Another few weeks, the doctor said, and the consequences could have been irreversible. She cried when she understood what had been happening. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, like grief finally allowed to speak. But there was relief in those tears too. Relief that she wasn't losing her mind. Relief that the fog had a cause and that it could lift. It did. Within a week of stopping the supplements, color returned to her face. The confusion eased. Her voice grew steadier. Watching that transformation felt like watching someone come back from a long, unnecessary winter. The investigation moved faster than I expected. Caleb's office wasn't just a trove of personal betrayal. It was a record of interstate fraud, identity theft, financial manipulation. The evidence from his computer filled box after box, emails, templates, browser histories he'd never truly erased. For someone who believed himself untouchable, he'd left a remarkable trail. More women came forward, not just the ones we knew. Others from different states, different years, all telling versions of the same story. Whirlwind romance, financial control, isolation, decline, escape, or worse. Rachel's case was reopened. The bowling league had its own reckoning. Men who'd trusted him with their savings felt foolish, angry, betrayed. One of them, Frank's nephew, helped connect the dots digitally, tracing patterns Caleb had repeated across states and years. What felt overwhelming to me looked obvious to someone trained to follow data. Patterns always do. The trial took less time than the damage had. Caleb's defense leaned on confusion, on misunderstanding, on the idea that everything he'd done was meant to help. The prosecutor dismantled that narrative piece by piece. Documents spoke when words failed. Timelines contradicted excuses. Video showed intention where he claimed accident. When the verdict came back, guilty on all counts, I didn't feel triumph. I felt tired. 15 years. The number landed with weight, not satisfaction. It didn't erase what he'd done. It didn't give back lost time or stolen health. It didn't bring Rachel back. It simply drew a line that said, "This ends here." Caleb tried to speak at sentencing. He talked about being misunderstood, about wanting to take care of his family. The judge stopped him mid-sentence. "The only person you took care of," she said, "was yourself." My mother got the house back, free and clear. Civil suits followed. Settlements were reached. Not everyone was made whole, but the machinery that had allowed him to operate so freely was dismantled. Healing didn't arrive all at once. It came in small, unremarkable moments. My mother standing in the kitchen without supervision, choosing her own groceries, forgetting a word and laughing instead of apologizing, turning Caleb's old office into a craft room, sunlight spilling where secrecy once lived. She started making quilts for the local women's shelter. Each one felt like a quiet reclaiming. I started working with a victim advocacy group, not because I had answers, but because I understood the questions. It turns out many people think abuse has to be loud to be real, that if there aren't bruises, there isn't violence. They're wrong. The most dangerous damage happens slowly. It happens in systems, in routines, in moments small enough to explain away until they aren't. The women from the group chat still meet. We call ourselves survivors, not because it sounds strong, but because it's accurate. We share stories now without fear. We laugh more than we thought we ever would. The past doesn't own us, even if it shaped us. Sometimes, I think back to that hospital floor. The cold tile, the blood, the moment everything broke open. I used to wish it had never happened. Now I understand something I couldn't then. That moment didn't create the truth. It revealed it. If you're watching this and something in your life feels wrong but hard to name, trust that instinct. Pay attention to patterns, talk to someone. Quiet control is still control. And survival doesn't always look like escape. It sometimes looks like patience, documentation, and choosing the right moment to act. If this story resonated with you, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you feel safe doing so, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. You're not as alone as you think. My name is Grania Martinez, and this is the story of how the truth finally found daylight and how we learned to live in it.